You found your way to Blood Moon Radio. I'm Coralie, and this is where we follow the threads the world wants us to drop. Today we start a 3-part mini-series exploring the history of witchcraft in Canada. For today's episode, we're traveling back into New France, into the shadows of the early colony, where fear, superstition, and power shaped the handful of witchcraft accusations that left their mark on this land. It's a smaller history than the infamous trials to the south, but it's no less revealing. So settle in and let's step quietly into the world of New France, where the line between the magical and the forbidden was thin and often political. Welcome to another episode of Blood Moon Radio. It's almost December, and I thought that it might be a good time to slow things down a bit. So this is the first of a 3-part series of mini episodes, and we're going to delve into a topic that I've touched on in both Reclaiming Witch and Woven, the history of witchcraft in Canada. The folklore, the fears, the accusations, and the people caught up inside the machinery of colonial superstition. Part of creating this series is because the witch archetype is woven into so much of our cultural imagination, especially here in North America. But very few people know what the historical record actually looks like. Most of the popular narratives come from Europe or the early American colonies. Canada's history is quieter, stranger, and in many ways far more revealing. This episode is inspired in part by my research, including a fantastic article that you can find on unwrittenhistories.com, which examines documented witchcraft cases in early Canada and the social systems that shaped them. I'll link it in the reading room on bloodmoonradio.com for anyone who wants to dig deeper into that. Before we dive in fully, this is my last standard episode of the year. On December 26th, I'll be releasing a special host-read story episode, a winter or Yule-themed tale to close out the year on a softer, more enchanted note. Parts 2 and 3 of this witchcraft history series will be released in January, once we step into the new year. So, let's begin where all thresholds open, with the question, what did witchcraft mean on early Canadian soil, and who decided that? To understand witchcraft in early Canada, we need a quick grounding in the landscape of colonization. Both France and Britain were vying for control here, each bringing their own laws, their own religious anxieties, and their own very different ideas of what made someone a witch. These histories unfolded against the backdrop of immense harm to Indigenous nations, displacement, cultural suppression, and forced conversion. Indigenous spiritual practices were often misinterpreted or demonized by colonizers because European worldviews couldn't comprehend them. That misunderstanding shaped how early colonial courts defined superstition, magic, and heresy. This is not an Indigenous witchcraft story, but it is a story about how European fears were carried onto Indigenous land. France's witchcraft laws were actually much more reasonable and restrained compared to Britain's. By the time New France was established, the French legal system had moved away from the mass witch hunts happening elsewhere in Europe. Their courts required evidence, discouraged torture, and were skeptical of spectral claims. Britain was very much not on that page. The British witchcraft statutes, especially those of the 16th and 17th centuries, fueled some of the most notorious witch crazes in the world. But here's the interesting part. When Britain colonized what became English Canada, the witch-hunting hysteria did not cross the ocean with them. If anything, you could almost imagine a few clever British witches quietly slipping across the Atlantic for some peace and quiet. New France, however, did have cases, and many of them involved men. That's one of the things that makes Canadian witch history so unusual. Where European witchcraft accusations overwhelmingly targeted women, New France saw a notable number of male defendants, often tied to accusations of sorcery, fortune-telling, or charm-making. Some of the reasons given for men being accused more than women in the New France witch trials are that the population was overwhelmingly male, and also that having a wife was a scarcity. And so people were accused of messing with others' chances or creating scenarios where other men would be sterile, or things that would cause the wife to leave the husband so that a new suitor could have a chance. Jean Champignard, a French soldier in New France, was accused in the 1650s of practicing sorcery. His case reflects a pattern. Men charged with magical offenses linked to gambling, charms, and attempts to influence luck rather than diabolical witchcraft. This is a great example in contrast to the European norms. One of the few women accused in New France, and a fascinating one, is Anne Lamarck. Anne was charged with possessing a grimoire, which in reality was more of an herbal and medicinal notebook. Her case carries that familiar European formula: a woman with knowledge of plants, healing, or who can be deemed too sexual becomes suspicious in the eyes of the church. There's also interesting lore in Canadian history that doesn't relate at all to trials. In Atlantic Canada, the Acadian community of Cheticamp has stories of witches who traveled by night, caused storms, or shapeshifted, sometimes mischievous, sometimes protective. This lore reflects cultural blending, Acadian, Mi'kmaq, and French storytelling merging into something uniquely Canadian. They're a perfect example of how witch identity can shift from criminal accusation into cultural myth. In Reclaiming Witch, I touched on probably the most famous case, the one that isn't actually related to a witch trial at all, but if you Google Canadian witch trials, the name will come up, and that is Marie Josephette Corriveau, also known as La Corriveau. She needs to be referenced here because she is often grouped in with witch legends, but she was not convicted of witchcraft. She was found guilty of murdering her husband in 1763, and her body was displayed in an iron cage, something that later storytellers turned into witchcraft imagery. Her transformation into a witch figure reveals more about cultural memory than historical fact. It also, as I touched on in Reclaiming Witch, draws on some of the more patriarchal underpinnings to witchcraft trials in general. In this first part of the series, we've stepped into New France, a place where French legal skepticism kept witchcraft cases relatively grounded, where folklore and fact began to twist together in ways that still haunt our storytelling today. In part 2, we're going to start to look at witchcraft traditions in Canada, from the syncretic nature of many witches' practices, born of our coming from other places, to the development of Odyssean Wicca, to the laws that govern witchcraft and their history and role in Canadian culture. For the third, we're going to look at the role of witchcraft in Canada today, highlight some of the more well-known witchy practitioners, such as Monica, who we've had on the show, and examine how that plays into the current political North American landscape. What all of these stories, the trials of New France, the herbal notebooks mistaken for grimoires, the Acadian witches of Cheticamp, and the mythology built around figures like La Corriveau reveal is that the history of witchcraft in Canada doesn't follow the familiar patterns we expect. Instead of mass hysteria or large-scale witch hunts, Canada's early witchcraft landscape is a mix of cautious legal systems, cultural misunderstandings, and deeply human fears. Accusations here were shaped by the particulars of colonial life: isolation, superstition, relationships with the land, the anxieties of small communities, and the very real pressures and violence of colonization itself. And threaded through all of this is a tension that I think still resonates today. The struggle to define what is folk knowledge, what is forbidden, and who gets to decide. For now, this has been our first step, a threshold really, into understanding the very particular, very strange, and often overlooked history of witchcraft in Canada. Thank you for listening to part 1. If you'd like to support the show, please head over to bloodmoonradio.com. There you can find physical merch, digital merch, membership options, and a donation button. If you'd like to give us support in other ways, please like, follow, share, and subscribe on our various channels. And until next time, remember, the truth echoes louder after dark. Whispered, unfiltered, waiting to be touched. See you soon.